This video was brought to you by Brilliant. Now, any of us who have rented in London will know just how expensive it can be. As properties are so often snatched up quickly, landlords are able to pit potential tenants up against each other, forcing them to engage in a bidding war in order to secure the property. And as a result of such high demand and low supply, rents have had to put up with above inflation rent rises. For instance, in April of this year, rent inflation was recorded at 10.8%, much higher than wage growth of only about 5.7%. This means that the average rent in London is now a huge £2,080, or roughly $2,675. So it's unsurprising that some politicians want to do something about this. According to The Telegraph, the London Mayor Sadiq Khan has been in talks with the Labour government about introducing some kind of rent controls in the capital in order to get the situation under control. So in this video, we're going to dive into this, having a look at exactly what would need to happen for such controls to be introduced, whether Khan will indeed introduce them, and how they've worked for other countries. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Now, it's worth starting this video by explaining that, at least currently, the Mayor of London doesn't actually have the power to introduce rent controls. As such, Parliament would have to pass legislation specifically granting him this power. And this is significant, because this is probably the main reason that the controls don't currently exist in London. From his side, Sadiq Khan has been clear that this is something he'd want to see in the capital, with him first raising the proposition all the way back in 2016. In fact, in a major press release on the London Mayor's website last year, they referred to this plan as the Mayor's long-standing call for rent controls. So, given that Khan has been calling for this for the better part of a decade, it's unsurprising to hear that Khan's tried to negotiate more power as Mayor so he can finally introduce the policy. However, as a Labour mayor negotiating with a Conservative government, he didn't fare particularly well in these negotiations, and these additional powers were routinely rejected. But, as you may or may not be aware, there was something of a major general election in the UK recently, one that ended 14 years of Conservative rule and put the Labour Party back in power. It would be reasonable to assume then that perhaps Khan could finally get the power he's been asking for, and finally be able to introduce a rent cap. Unfortunately, things just aren't that simple. When he was leader, Jeremy Corbyn backed Khan's proposals, but Starmer hasn't been as keen on this idea. Last year, Labour insiders told the FT that while Khan had carried out trailblazing work on affordable homes and increased tenants' protections, Starmer's office would not explore either national rent controls or related powers to mayors if elected. And this was obviously a huge blow to Khan. There were some signs this year, though, that perhaps Starmer could be changing his view on this. Back in June, Starmer appeared on a Question Time Leaders special and stated that he wanted to try and eliminate bidding wars on rented properties. Now, while Starmer was pretty tight-lipped on exactly how he'd do this, it did raise some eyebrows, with some, such as The Telegraph, questioning whether Starmer had actually changed his mind on some kind of rent cap. What raised eyebrows even further was an interview on BBC Radio Essex with Rachel Reeves. She was asked whether she would commit to introducing some kind of cap on rents, and she replied by stating, "Where that has happened, it's not always delivered the results that people might want. I think that should be up to local areas to decide. There might be the case for that in some local areas, but as a blanket approach, I'm not convinced by that." So while there is some evidence that Labour may give Khan the powers he needs to introduce rent controls, there is also some other evidence that demonstrates that perhaps Starmer isn't ready to hand over this power just yet. Only this week, a government spokesperson said that ministers have no plans whatsoever to devolve rent control powers. Additionally, the Housing Minister, Angela Rayner, recently stated that there have been no conversations with the London Mayor about introducing rent control. Now, the point we're making here is that while, at least for the moment, it looks unlikely that Starmer's going to give Khan the powers to introduce rent controls, there are signs that he might at some point in this parliament. So, with this in mind, let's move on and look at what Khan would do if he was given this power. Now, since 2022, Khan has spoken in favour specifically of a 2-year rent freeze on rental properties, with him arguing that this would be a lifeline for London renters, and that it could prevent people from becoming homeless. Khan has also spoken in favour of creating a commission, which includes renters and landlords, to figure out what the best form of rent control would be for London. So it seems that Khan wants to introduce a rent freeze first and foremost, before figuring out what specific kind of rent control would work for London in the long run. But what would this actually mean for London's renters? Well, according to Khan himself, this could save about £3,374 on average for each renter, with £887 saved in the first year and £2,487 saved in the second. Obviously, the cost of renting is so enormous that this will be welcomed by renters across the city. However, while this would be good for renters in the short term, there are some arguments that this will be bad for landlords and possibly even worse for renters in the long run. Firstly, a freeze wouldn't actually go any way towards solving the housing crisis, which is one of the main reasons behind such high rents. Secondly, it could act as a disincentive for landlords, meaning fewer rental properties, and thus making it even harder for people to find rental spaces. And thirdly, it could act as a disincentive for landlords to invest in their properties. Broadly, this was the experience in Scotland, which introduced rent controls to help with the cost of living back in 2022. And following their implementation, the average wait time to find a property went from 12 weeks to 16, and 44% of landlords have either reduced or completely stopped spending money on maintenance and improvements. Now, we're not saying that rent freezes are a bad idea, just that there are pros and cons, and that they need to be thought through. Given that it looks unlikely that Khan will be given the power to introduce them in the short term, it seems that at least he'll have the time to consider the pros and cons before he's allowed to implement them.
There's a lot of difficult decisions to make here, and making huge decisions is difficult, even for world leaders. The good thing is that Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data, programming, and AI. Their interactive classes help build your critical thinking skills through problem solving, not memorizing. So while you're building real knowledge on specific topics, you'll also be becoming a better thinker. For instance, their Predicting with Probability course can help you better understand and assess the world around you. You can learn to wrangle massive datasets, compare distributions, and master fundamental concepts like Bayes' theorem. That might sound a little technical, but with their active learning, you learn this by answering questions like which airline is least likely to have a delay due to weather, and how much more unruly airline passengers have gotten since the pandemic. Data skills are absolutely necessary for navigating the modern world, and Brilliant is the best way to get them. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/TLDR, or click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.